All right, so welcome everybody. Today we are going to talk about adjusting reeds with a ReedGeek, a really handy tool that's very simple to use. If you're afraid to adjust your reeds, this is a great way to get started. And it's an easy way into getting a little control over your playing experience. Not as much control as we saw that Stas had with his machine reed making process, but this is reed adjustment on a budget. So today I'm going to be using the ReedGeek Geeklet, and they are currently discounting a set that comes with the plaque and gauge, which can be very helpful as you're getting used to working on your reeds and trying to make the most good effect the most quickly possible. Okay, so when we play a reed, there are a few things that we want to listen for. We want to listen for resonance, and we want to listen for evenness across the registers. So one of my favorite ways to get an idea right away is to play a shorter note in each register. And that lets me hear if it's resonating at the end. And an ideal reed is going to resonate across those registers. Now, ReedGeek has a really cool chart that helps us dive into what specifically affects the reed. And I'm also going to use a lot of charts from some well-known clarinet pedagogues, and we're going to compare them and overlay them and find the best way to understand what makes your reed tick. Now, there's a really cool bonus to having the reed gauge and plaque, and I'm going to show that to you right now. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So every mouthpiece is a little bit different, and the sound you get is truly a product of your oral cavity, the reed, and the mouthpiece. You don't want to use the same reed on every mouthpiece. You want to get to know your mouthpiece and figure out what sounds the best on it. It's important to remember that if you have an open-faced mouthpiece, it's going to need a softer reed. Why is that? It's going to need a softer reed because there's more space between the mouthpiece and the reed, and it has to travel farther to come back. When you have the plaque and the gauge, it's really easy to check your own mouthpiece. So you can place the line up by the tip of the mouthpiece, and it's going to give you an idea of how open or closed your mouthpiece is. You're going to take the gauge. This is very similar to that playing exam where we put the piece of paper behind the reed to see where it vibrates. It's the fulcrum, in a sense, where the reed moves back and forth. So the first thing you want to look for in your mouthpiece is that it's even on the rails. That's how it holds the reed. And as you can see, mine is lying straight across, and that's a good sign. If it's not straight, you probably need to reface your mouthpiece. It's not game over, but it needs some work. So when I look at this, I can tell that my mouthpiece is about medium open facing, and I have down to that 15 to make adjustments on my reed. If I have a more closed mouthpiece, that's going to be a different number. But so then I can take that same plaque and I place my reed on the same spot, and I know that up to 15, that's the part of the reed that's going to vibrate. So I can even make a little mark there with my pencil. And I tell you what, this reed's pretty good, so we don't want to work on it so much, but let's pick a reed that's not going to be quite as good. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that spot about, oops, that's the wrong spot. That's why they built erasers. So I'm going to mark that 15 there. I can put it on both sides. And that's the part of the reed that's truly going to vibrate and move away from the reed and back. away from the mouthpiece and back, excuse me. All right, so when we go back to that diagram, this gives a new meaning to one of the markings that we see. You can see that they also put their reed with the gauge, and they did it already sitting on the mouthpiece. That's another way to try it out. But that B marking is where the gauge sat, and that's where we're going to start preserving the heart. Okay? So the very first thing we want to talk about with the reed are that we have two different parts. We have vibrating parts and we have resisting parts. And it's very important to always separate it into those two basic camps. We can get very bogged down with a lot of information when we forget that. But truly, the reed is searching to vibrate. The vibrations are what makes the sound, and anything we do with our embouchure is supposed to enable that. All right, so when I look at a reed, I can see, even when I hold it up to the light, that there is a shape to it, especially Van Doren reeds. You have that inverted bell curve that goes up and back down. And that preserves the heart, which is right in the center, right around that B marking that we made. And then it shows the wings. The wings are going to be the most flexible part, and that's up towards the top of the reed. The reed, it's important to remember, is going to get thicker and more resistant as you head down towards the bark, and it's going to get thicker as you head towards the center. And that's a balance that we want to preserve. Okay, there's another little map up here that shows some different areas. So there's the heart, and there's the place, the fulcrum, where the reed moves from the mouthpiece. And everyone is going to tell you, don't remove wood from the heart. We saw Stas do some clipping, very small amounts. Most reed clippers that I've seen are not that minute in their adjustments. And then we divide the clarinet reed into sections, and things up here are going to affect the upper register, and this is going to affect response. So we're going to talk a little bit about articulation and how we deal with the rails. And then when we get below the heart, that's a little more the middle register. We have more low register tone for if it's stuffy. When Stas needed to downgrade a half size on his reeds, that was exactly where he went first to lighten up the reed. So removing wood is going to brighten the tone and improve the response, which is what we associate with a lighter reed. Now, the other most important thing with the reed is that as you adjust this, you keep the balance. These are wonderful points of symmetry that Daniel Bonad put together for us. And you'll notice it covers quite a bit of the reed. So we have the very tip, and again, if you clip it, you're going to have to make sure that it's very even, just like he was making sure that the base of the reed was very even. And then we have these corners right on the wings underneath the tip. We have this spot, which is going to affect the middle register a little more. This is going to affect articulation a little more. And this is going to get into the middle register, and then we have the lower register, and that has to do with how that bell curve starts and comes back. Okay? So when we talk about the reed, we have the heart. That's important to remember. We have the tip, and a lot of times we refer to the bark as the vamp. All right? Now, as I mentioned, you have increasing responsiveness, increasing flexibility as you go towards the tip and as you go towards the side. That means that these tips here are going to be the weakest part of the reed, which is why Stas said that when you work on this part of the reed, you sometimes make its life a little shorter, because if it gets paper thin, it's going to be less reliable. Now, the other direction, we're increasing resistance, and this is going to be your point of greatest resistance. We're also increasing resistance as we go towards the center. It's important to remember. All right, so when we do response tests, we always want to know what we're listening for. So I put on a reed I don't like quite as much, and I'm going to show you a couple of Ridenour response tests. So for the Ridenour, he loves to talk about the side to side. It's important to remember as you do the side to side test, you're actually closing off the reed when you go to the other side. So when I move my face, I close this side of the reed and I'm listening to the opposite side of the reed. That's very important to remember. So I would say that I prefer the right side of the reed. That's a response that I like better. The other one was a little bright and tinny to me, which means that it's not getting all of the partials. So at that point, I would decide maybe this isn't quite balanced. When a reed isn't balanced, the easiest thing, as he mentioned, is to make sure that the back of the reed is flat. So I'm not going all the way to the tip. I can support it with my finger. I can also work on it on the plaque if I want to stabilize it a bit more. And what's really cool about the ReedGeek is that you can see on the edge of the blade how much comes off, and you have an idea of what you're taking off. Otherwise, you kind of have to look at the floor. That's one of the reasons why I prefer it to sandpaper. It's a little easier to see that, and it's a little easier to maintain even pressure across instead of when you're pressing the reed on the sandpaper. Wherever we're pressing the reed tends to get a little more pressure. So now I can see if that made a difference in itself just by making it flatter. Made quite a bit of difference. Now, the side that I liked actually feels a little stuffier, and the other side feels quite perfect. So you always want to start there and make sure, because it's going to make a big difference right away. Now that I know that they're not quite even, I'm going to take my finger, I'm going to lightly press and feel. So I can feel this side move more, and this side is a little stodgier. Now, one of the reasons our lives are so much more simple than those who make oboe reeds is that we don't have to preserve the rails of the reed as much as they do. The tip of the reed is important, but the rails of the reed are not as structurally important because our rails are provided by that mouthpiece and reed relationship. So when I work on this reed, I can put it back on the gauge, on the plaque, and I'm going to use, there are different sides to this tool. There's one that looks kind of like an eraser, and then there are sharper edges if you have something more detailed to do. I'm going to use the eraser shaped part. I'm going to start about right there on the reed. So if I go back to my first diagram, I'm looking at the A section right there, but I'm not going to go all the way up to the tip. I'm going to get a little bit of rail and a little bit of that upward motion. So I just lightly press and move up and release. I'm not taking a whole lot off, but then I'm going to feel it again. Still feels kind of stodgy, so I do it again. And this is how we're going to balance it out. All right, I don't come down over the tip. I'm always going up to the tip, and I like to stop before to preserve the life of the reed. So now I'm going to try it one more time. All right, so this side is still a little stodgy. I'm going to take a little bit off. And a lot of times you'll find, just like when you're working on stuff for your teacher, that in trying to fix something you go a little too far and you have to swing the pendulum the other way. Oh, so I'm going to take a little bit more off. I can feel when I'm adding more lip pressure. That's typically why we play really sharp with reeds that are a little too hard for us. We meet resistance with more resistance. And that's often a cause for squeaks because we're just trying too hard to control something. All right, so I feel it again. I like that better. And that feels nicer. So another test that I like to do is a dynamic response test, where I'm going to start with a loud sound and decay to pianissimo and see if my reed can handle it. So it's not holding on as long as I want in the piano. And if I notice that unevenness in the dynamic test, I'm going to call it a little bit of a response issue. And I'm going to go a little bit down the sides along the rail, right there. So I'm going to do that on both sides. And try it again. So now I can tell that I can hold the pitch longer and softer without having to squeeze with my lips. So that's a good sign. That means that the response is more balanced, and now I have the tips more balanced as well. Well, I'm going to get farther down into the reed, so I'm going to use pitch range exercise, which is also a great voicing exercise. I'm going to use the 12th from C up to G, and then I lift the first finger to go to the E, and I can add the E flat there, and then I go to the left hand C sharp key. And I want to try and do this softly. And make sure that it'll speak. That felt pretty nice in the upper register. The E and the A both responded quite well. So I can test it and see just how soft I can get on the A. And you can try articulating as well to make sure that you have control over it on the A. So I'm pretty happy with that. But if I had trouble with the C, I would work lower on the reed. And if I had trouble with the G, I'd work in that middle register area, and the E and A would be higher up on the reed. So since that reed did do so well, I'm going to try a different one. Let's see if we can't get a treble spot to work on. Because we have a couple of different strategies that you see on the ReedGeek diagram. So if it's in the middle register, typically I'm going to preserve the heart, and I'm going to use this inverted V, okay? And I'm going to head up towards the center again, respecting that balance of more resistance in the center going in and getting less resistant as we go up. So that's why I use this V. And then if I'm struggling with the lower register, I like to call this a singing W, and I'll actually put in a little V there, a little nested V in a way. And that's what will get me more ping in the lower register. Because what we're always looking for, we're looking for more highs in our lows and more lows in our highs. And those are those partials that are going to sound across the instrument. Well, I guess all my reeds just want to speak really well in the altissimo now. I'm not complaining. Well, let's try one more. Ah, there's a good stuffy one. So it's a little pinched in the high register and it's pretty stuffy down below. So again, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to flatten it. Flatten the back. Didn't take nearly as much off as I thought it would. Guess you're not so warped. Then I can do a little bit of a field test, and already with this hand I can feel that this side is much more restricted. So I'm going to do just a little bit up like that. And you know what? I'm going to give this reed the works since it didn't sound that great. So that inverted V, anytime you're working on this, if you want to, you can draw on it. So again, we knew that my reed vibrates around 15. So I make that mark there. And then I'm going to draw my V going up from that. So there I have those marks to follow along. And now the wings would be up there. I draw them a little more lightly. And the W is going to go up towards the wings. And come down. So that's how I'm going to get into the heart. And then, like I said, I have that little nested W. All right. So again, with this tool, I can see where I take it off. And again, you can work on it against your hand. You can work on the plaque. So I'm preserving the heart. I'm coming in from both sides. And I'm going to go for that W. And so I try to do long strokes going up. And this is in the direction of the reed fibers. We try not to work across them. Sometimes we use an angle, but you don't want to go straight across. You want to respect those tubes. That's how the reed carries moisture. All right, so you can tell I already took off a lot along those lines. I'm going to try it again. So this register test helps us really pinpoint. And we're already much better. But there's still a little resistance in that higher register. So like Stas said, I can work in that area instead of going straight to the wings. I can broaden out a bit from my V. So I'm working more in that mid area. And just thinking of that, oops, bell and preserving this ratio of getting weaker. All right, so let's see how we did. Much better, okay? So again, like I said, I can check the octaves. And another test that I really like to do is to check the partials. And not just the partials, but the partials with articulation. So the clarinet is a closed pipe, and we don't get every overtone like the other instruments. We actually only get every other, which is why our register key doesn't overblow at the octave, which is the first resonating partial. It overblows at the odd one, so the third, and that's the 12th. Okay? So when I hold down the C, if I overblow the C, I I can get the 12th and I can get the E above it. I can even get the A above it, but I'm mostly testing the lower two. I want to make sure that I can articulate on them. If they're a little stodgy, then I'm going to match them with the register they're in and do a little more finesse work. That felt pretty good. Another test I really like is by Steve Williamson, the principal clarinet of the Chicago Phil. And what he does, he uses phantom tones. And this is an exercise he'll do over the whole clarinet from E all the way up to C7, the double high C. And you might not be able to hear it very well over Zoom, but it's basically pitched air. It's very, very soft, and you're making sure that the reed will speak right away. So if you don't have a ReedGeek tool and you don't want to do option A, this is from the Rittenauer book, and you can see he does go all the way to the tip. So there are quite a few people who will adjust all the way past the tip. But if you trust Stas, which I think you should, you're going to keep your reed longer if you preserve that tip. The mouthpiece does provide some support, but if you think about it, with the fulcrum, the part that's going to move the farthest away is the tip. So that's the part we need to preserve the most. But if you're using sandpaper, you can use a sort of circular motion to get down to the tip of the reed. And then Rittenauer likes to show the middle register on the rails and focusing on that circled part. And a lot of times this makes a big difference if you're experiencing stuffy articulation. Sometimes the rails are just a little bit uneven, so you want to balance both sides. And then for more singing quality in the middle register, you're going to use that upside down V that preserves the heart. All right, and then we talked about in the lower register on the ReedGeek, we talked about the W that you can see in this, going down, up, and down, and it correlates with his sections here. So sometimes people refer to this as the window underneath the heart, and that's an also important area for adjusting the reed. Now there's some other things to know about the reed, very similar to how oboists work on them. So when we decide that we like a brand of reed or we don't, or when Stas is deciding exactly how he's going to make his reeds, how he wants them, there are some aspects that change the intonation quite a bit, and they're very important. So if you're constantly playing sharp, yes, it could be that you're squeezing with your embouchure, but it might also be that you're playing a reed that doesn't totally suit you. So the length of the tip, the longer the length of the tip is, the lower the reed is going to sound. The shorter the tip, the sharper. And that's a golden rule that oboists use all the time. You also want to think about the ratio from the heart, the very thickest part of the reed, and the tip. If there's a huge difference and your tip is paper thin, the reed's going to play a little flatter. And I mean, you can tell he was talking about how Diodario reeds can be thinner at the top. Well, most people who use them play in American orchestras, and American orchestras typically play 440 to 442, whereas European orchestras will play 442, sometimes all the way up to 446. So that's an important cut issue to keep in mind. Personally, I play Van Doren V12 reeds on B-flat clarinet and E-flat clarinet, but I actually play Diodario reeds on bass clarinet because I feel like it works better with the articulation. It gives me a little more flexibility and a little more immediacy of response. So that's something I like on bass clarinet. The other thing to keep in mind is the thickness of the heart. The thicker the heart is, the sharper the reed's going to play, the thinner, the flatter it plays. And then we talked about those windows right behind the heart and that can also raise the pitch if those are higher or lower. So when you do your adjustments on the bottom of the reed, even that can make a difference with the pitch. And then the most important part is we have that spine, and if you undo that spine, it's going to be pretty erratic. The last thing to keep in mind is the gouge of the cane, which is the thickness of the reed. And it was really cool. I mean, with his Perfecta reed, Stas has measured a bunch of them, and there are differences between the blue box and the V12, and if you're not happy with your reed, it is a good idea to experiment, and that could be one of the reasons why you're not happy with it. So, as he mentioned, the density of the cane determines the strength, but the gouge of the cane is the thickness of the reed, and that's basically what you look at with the butt of the reed. And if you compare a bunch of marks, you will see that quite a few of them are different, which is pretty crazy. The other thing to keep in mind are the different filing systems. So we have the American squared tip, and that's like Diodario. You get a little more ease of response. So it's this top reed right here. You see it's more rounded, almost square. And the trick is this is easier to balance. When you have this bell curve, there are more places for error for a little extra thickness. So for students, we often suggest the Rico reeds because they are more consistent. They might have a little less flexibility, a little less nuance, but they're more consistent out of the box. And that thicker tip gives you some added support. And you also have a little extra material at the bottom. All right, so the French style of filing, you can see on this reed as well. It's a very narrow lip at the bottom, and when you hold it up to the light, you can see that bell curve. And like he said, some reeds out of the box you might see it very clearly. Some you might be like, ooh, that looks uneven. But again, let them breathe, let them come into their own. Typically when I break in reeds, I will take them out, unwrap them from their plastic, and I will put them in my Ziploc bag with my other reeds. I like the Rico cases, and I even made my own glass case. It's just a plaque of glass with rubber bands on it. It works quite well so that you can break in. I typically break in 5 reeds at a time, and I try to have 10 reeds that I could play a concert on, 10 reeds that I've already played concerts on, and they're not peak, but they're okay for practice, and then 10 reeds that I'm breaking in. And I'll do it in groups of 5 so that they're not all on the same day. I'm gonna have to try out the rainy day theory though. I had never heard of that. But when I first break them and I unwrap them and I put them in the plastic bag with my reeds, and I don't play them at all the very first day. I just let them along for the ride. And then the second day, I will wet them. And once I have wetted the reed, I'm going to close the pores with my finger. Those tubes, they tend to suck in a lot of water, and that's why your reed gets really dark in color if you leave it too long in the water. And then I'll try it just for a minute, no more, and then I'll close the pores again and I'll put it away. The next day I wet it, I rub the pores down again, and then I play on it maybe 2 minutes, rub the pores, and put it away. So my reeds have a pretty easy life at the beginning. They don't work much and they get a massage. And then the next day I'd up it to 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, and then 20. So I just kind of double it each time, and that's my rule. And they tend to come into their own. And one of the important things about reed balancing is that you need to know when to stop. There is no final adjustment. Oops. The reed is breathing in a sense that it's wood and it will always be reactive to its situation. We can reduce the reaction to water by easing it into it, but it is going to react to the weather. It is going to react to the amount of humidity, and that's normal. We try to just control those variables and keep it from being a large adjustment. But so when I make an adjustment to a reed, I know that the next day it might not be exactly the same. This is also because the general tension in your lips on a given day can be different. Some days you wake up and you're more tense. So typically if I'm working on a reed, I'll do 3 to 4 adjustments to a particular reed on a given day, and then I say, you know what, we'll revisit it tomorrow. We'll take a break. And so if you're working on multiple reeds at once, it's less pressure and it's less daunting to make small adjustments. If you're absolutely terrified to work on your reeds, I suggest picking a reed that you hate and try and save it. You can also take a reed that you hate and you can cover it with charcoal. So you just take the pencil and you shade it all over the reed, and then you use your tool to take it off and see what kind of effect it makes on the reed. Because as soon as you take the wood off where there was charcoal, you'll see the difference in what you've done. Now, I did have a really fun project. I almost translated a book from the granddaughter of the Rico owner, and it's in French, but it talks all about the process of making the reeds. It shows beautiful pictures of cane in southern France and the really big machines that they use to do their sorting. So if you imagine Stas's production times 1,000, this is the Rico factory and some of the same machines and the way that they sort them and measure their density to see what mark they are. And they use a diamond blade, which is the sharpest. And then just like you saw with his pictures, the cane comes in a round tube, and we have different types of reeds here to work at. So these are all saxophones. We have the tenor, baritone, soprano, and alto saxophone. We have the bassoon and oboe reeds that you can see there. And then these are the clarinet reeds. So it looks very similar to what Stas showed us with after he splits the reed. This is the interior and the exterior, and then the interior and exterior after he shapes it, and this was the profile, and then that tip, that magical little that made it look like a reed. Alright, so I have some additional sources for you for working on reeds, some of the things that helped me. There are lots of resources out there, and on Facebook there are even groups so that you can follow around and watch a lot of videos. And I have some more ReedGeek videos for bass clarinet and for intonation adjustments on my Instagram page. And I always tell people, if you want to learn more about reeds, ask an oboist. They spend a lot of time thinking about it, and it's always good to have that perspective and realize that really we have it quite easy. It's really not as bad as we think it is. So I hope you enjoy the rest of this festival. If you have any questions, you can always reach out. And we're going to have Stas Chernishev on campus tomorrow, and we're going to do our orchestral final, and we are going to perform for you that night with the Mendelssohn Concertstück, and he's going to play the Copland Concerto. So, do we have any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, how would you say how much longer do your reeds last when you do adjustments compared to when you don't do any at all to them?
That's a great question. So some reeds I actually don't adjust. Every once in a while I get a reed that's just fine, and then at a certain point its life expires. So typically a reed, I'll play on it for probably 3 weeks, and after 3 weeks, if I am feeling a little desperate, I'll try and do some CPR to make it last a little longer, and that'll be some rebalancing, and that'll usually gain it another week or so. So when I've played a reed for about a month, I feel pretty good that I've gotten my money's worth out of it, and then it can turn into a project or whatever. If I do work on the reed from the very beginning, I'm really curious to see if not touching the tip does lengthen the life of the reed noticeably, but I tend to find that the reeds that I work on probably require adjustments about every 3 days, and they also last about 3 weeks. But then sometimes I don't get that extra week of life-saving measures.
Okay, thank you.
Megan, did you have a question?
Yes. So I was just wondering, for those of us that are on a student budget, would you do the same process or maybe cut it down a little bit on the breaking in part for new reads? So I know you said that you break in 5 at a time,
Yes.
right? So should we do it also still like 5 at a time and then, or should we break it down to like 2 at a time maybe? I'm not sure.
That probably depends on how much you're playing a day. I mean, to get a
Okay.
good rotation in when I'm playing 4 to 5 hours a day, I need more reads.
Oh, okay.
If you're playing a little less, you can probably get away with less. But typically, even from middle school, I try to encourage students to break in 2 reads at a time. So they're not
Okay.
so dependent on the one read. I find that there's a lot less anxiety when you have options, as with
Yeah.
most things in life. So at the university level, I would probably suggest 3 or 4 at a time.
Okay.
And if you're rotating them, that's truly the secret to a longer life for a read.
Okay. Thank you.
And the break-in process, too, is very key, that you make it slow and methodical. Because if you take that read and you're desperate for a read and you pull it out of the box and you play it in rehearsal, you play it at that concert, it's probably going to die in about 3 to 5 days.
Yeah.
It's just
And also
shocked.
yeah. I had never heard of like the closing the pores after wetting it. Like I'll definitely try that.
Yeah, that'll
So
help
that
it to
helps.
soak up less water. You've all seen that when you leave your reed in too much and it turns almost orange,
Yes.
and you go, oh, those are the pores. They go like a sponge because
Yeah.
it's been so long since they took a drink. And they don't know when they'll get another drink, so they freak out a bit.
Okay,
Any
sounds
other
good.
questions? Thank you. So, if you are a TAMIC student, the exciting news is that we are going to pass out our ReedGeeks for the rest of the semester, and potentially, if you prove yourselves very responsible, Christmas break. And I have from surveys those of you who are interested in doing it, so those are going to be first on my list. And if there are any left over, I am happy to consider more interested parties. So I hope that this has answered some of your questions about reads. I know that Stas's presentation was really eye-opening for a lot of you, and I mean, it's incredibly soothing to watch. So if you have any other questions, you can also ask him when he's here on campus, and he's very available online as well. All right. Have a wonderful night. Thank you for joining me. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Dr. VR.
Bye.
Bye.